The propositions were kind of hard to swallow for people, and yet the fact that this group of people were willing to just totally wreck the whole thing for themselves and for everybody else gave a kind of peculiar subversive authority to their enterprises. That, you know, not to mention the fact that Gauguin actually was an incredibly inventive guy who knew a ton about painting, and that the work is not naive or stupid in any way. It's very well informed. And I had another thought about Gauguin, which I'll probably pick up when I see Pollock. I don't have right now. I've lost it. So, oh, I did want to say one thing about all the painters. If you look at the bios of all the painters in the show, painters, most of them who were born after 1850, you'll find a peculiar thing. A lot of these painters did not start out to be painters. They started out to be lawyers and philosophes and metaphysicians, and they have, even the modern guys, some of them have PhDs and masters. That's a very big break from the grand history of painting, where most painting was done by people who grew up in a workshop environment, who were involved with the building trades. Most of the great painters came out of that up to 1850 came out of that. If you, Gauguin, as everybody knows, was a banker. His family tried to get him to go straight, and he tried hard until he was about 40, and he couldn't quite hack it. And the interpretation that is given about some of these people is that they were failed or ruined guys who couldn't make it in the straight world, and then just sort of went off the deep end. And of course, guys like Gauguin and Van Gogh corroborate these notions. But in part, it is that the energy for restructuring painting, if I can put it that way, came from guys who had big ideas coming from other fields, from other places. Basically, late 19th century, early 20th century people. This is Edvard Munch, and there's a little Matisse there, and two German expressionists. And Kandinsky, I'll kind of, if anybody has any questions, I may be able to answer them. But Munch is an interesting guy. He's a sort of characteristic northern personality with all the sort of heavy Teutonic overtones that sort of characterize the work of a kind of doomed, romantic, poetic bunch of poets and writers in the North. And one of the things that shows up in Munch's work and shows up subsequently in a lot of the work of the 20th century is a kind of, I guess you could call it, it's a Freudian environment. Whether it's neurotic or not is up for you guys to decide, but there's a lot of heavy breathing about jealousy and the power of the female to corrupt the male, and strange darknesses that come out of a kind of nightmarish sensation that was not particularly brand new, and it actually you know, people who are looking for this can find this all the way back through the history of art. There's always been this what the Jungians call the dark side in art. It's part of the history and tradition of art, but in modern times it has a peculiar, for me, a peculiar meaning. When people talk about modernism, actually, I think that Goya was the first modern painter. That's my idea. And I haven't checked it out with the academics, but in any case, the thing about Goya was that Goya, you can see in Goya's early paintings, when he was still painting within the tradition of the courts and the church, that he was totally insincere. His religion, his religiosity, which was expected of painters who were associated with the heavy institutions, the church, they were expected to be able to give you a charge that verified and corroborated the religious sense of the times and of the institutions. Well, Goya, I saw a painting he did when he was 23 years old, a crucifixion in the Prado, which is an incredibly beautiful crucifixion, totally insincere. And eventually, Goya recognized his incapacity to actually lay in behind the meanings of these things. And he was forced to change his subjects, to look for other places. And he did a series of etchings called the Nightmare of Reason. He says, in the sleep of reason, what monsters may arise. I think the capacity for monstrosity in some way and darkness is partially generated in modern painting by the need of painters who no longer could be reassured by the conventions of the traditional spirituality to go look into their own sources for imagery. And that imagery, in Goya's case, came from very strange places, like strange puns in Spanish. He made creatures that actually reflected weird elisions in language. But this authority to just sort of go inward and come up with your own image of what's fundamental is, I think, started with Goya. And there were many other manifestations of it through painting. And eventually, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, especially around Austria and Vienna, there was this tremendous tapping into the power of sensualism, the libido, eros, and stuff like that. And it shows up in painting all the way through. I mean, you know, we'll see the Koenigs down there. Are they? Yeah. This is a Matisse. This is, you wouldn't know a ton about Matisse from this painting, although it's a very characteristic Matisse. In some, I mean, to include Matisse in the notion of romantic, I don't know. You know, I mean, it's true that he pinched his models behinds when he was 80 years old, if you want to call that romantic. Most artists think of Matisse as a strange case, a guy who seemed to be capable to be transcendent while being bourgeois, you know, and being a part of sort of the life of the successful middle classes in France. Although that shouldn't be too surprising, because when the patronage of the church and Napoleon fell apart in the early part of the 1800s, the painters had to look for other support. Obviously, painters have to be supported from somewhere, and even though a lot of painters think of themselves as great philosophers and priests, they usually are really just illustrators for the prevailing theology. And so the middle class became strong in France and other places of Europe, and they actually supported painters who were seen as radical by the population, but who somehow or other were comforting to the middle class. This painting, you know, when you think about it, is about the luxury, substance, and richness of a generous, sensual life of the middle class, I think. These two guys here are guys from what we call German Expressionism, but which are part of a tradition of painting in Germany, Austria, Norway, and other northern countries, which these guys suddenly developed a very tropical look to them, and you know, completely inconsistent with the actual light up there. Guys were missing in this exhibition. Guys like Emil Nolde went and buried themselves in the tropics and did these. One of the interesting things about this group of painters is that they were the target of Nazism eventually. And almost every painter in this room, except for Matisse, who didn't figure in the deal, were singled out by Hitler, who had been a painter, and who in some ways saw these guys as competitive. They were branded as degenerate. There were a lot of Jewish intellectuals and artists also involved in this whole Viennese intellectual revolution, the Fin de siècle, it's called the end of the century in Vienna. So there was also that Jewish connection in all this, the feeling that a whole part of the cultural community in northern Germany was not loyal, deeply loyal, to the foundations of German people's lives. That was probably true, because at that time there was these two tendencies. You know, one is to reassert the northern tradition, the Wagnerian saying, you know, of dropping of Christian icons and going back to the old gods of the Kalevala, which energized Northern European art, and at the same time, this big internationalism, this feeling like there was going to be one great universal art, and that all these guys collected African masks and African sculptures. They went to the flea markets in Vienna and Paris and picked up all this stuff, and they wanted to open up art again. They felt that it had been sort of held in by the values of the Renaissance too long, and that they couldn't function. But in any case, the German reaction was to consider these guys degenerate. And looking at these two paintings, who knows? This is Kandinsky. The folklore that I got when I was a young guy is that Kandinsky is the first guy that eliminates subject from painting once and for all and forever, and he was the first guy to just totally liberate painting from any obligations to a reference or a subject in nature. That issue comes up again when we look at the New York paintings, which we'll be going into right now. The question of what the subject of the artist is, and there was actually a school in New York called the subject of the artist, is a big issue. So Kandinsky gets the credit of blowing off the subject, or if you don't like that, he gets the blame for that. Kandinsky was another one of these guys who wasn't a painter up front to start from. He was a lawyer and he was philosophically oriented, and eventually he became sort of part of what was called the Transcendentalist group, people who were interested in new metaphysics, and who felt that the energy of painting could manifest sort of ineffable subjects that are not concrete enough to describe them in words, but areas of the psyche and of the spirit might be revealed in some way. This is an interesting trio of paintings for me because they're kind of in a chronological sequence, and you go from a sort of rebellious attitude towards nature. I'm going to see it my way. I'm going to not follow the old codes, and if it's a little wiggly, it's okay because my sentiments and my intuition drive me to this rejection of the old sort of formal structures to a kind of freewheeling wildness, and amazingly ends up in this kind of Polish peasant clothing design here, which it's a peculiar cycle because this guy turns out to be more rigid when it gets down to this. I mean, more tight, more edgy than the painting he rebelled against up front. So you gotta, people's lives and artists' lives have cycles themselves, and propositions that may seem transcendental at one point may simply be a step in the guy's life. There are a couple of books here which are not very informative about Kokoschka, who was a very popular and influential painter for a long time, who also, like a lot of these guys, were very conscious politically, was a part of... The artists identified themselves in this century as guys who had a right to criticize governance, culture, and whose own freedom in challenging the norms of the past made them sort of heroes of freedom of one sort or another. And some of these guys paid heavily for that. Their careers or their lives were in jeopardy. I think Paxton actually died during the Nazi regime, either in a concentration camp or in some as a consequence of it. A lot of them were exiled. Beckman came to the States. And actually, the Second World War is actually a very important time for the American painters we're going to see here, because American painting, well, for better or for worse, was really changed by the influx of European exile artists who came into New York right around the fascist era. I see friends and people here who actually know more about some of these guys than I do. And anybody who wants to get into it, I'm glad to surrender part of the responsibility. We should probably look at this basically mostly New York room here, with a few exceptions, maybe openly. At first, I don't really know who or where to start with. I will say that we have to take notice of the absence of some guys here who might make some of this a little more coherent. And one of the guys, of course, is Achille Gorky. And of the Europeans who are not in that room, who I think had a lot to say about what all of this is like, or some of this, we have to mention guys, of course, obviously Picasso, who almost everyone in this room, well, certainly Pollock and certainly de Kooning and their mentors in New York, were really aware of and moved by. A guy who isn't mentioned in all this, and isn't even mentioned in the texts that go with this, oddly enough, is Giacometti, who, to me, when I speak to painters and sculptors, there's not one who doesn't talk about Giacometti in some way or another. So we just have to realize that it would be impossible to fill out a whole history of this. But some of these motions into the future by these painters were moved along by guys from the past. I think I guess I'll talk about Pollock quickly because he was the bellwether, he was the lightning rod, he was the guy who, if you hated modern art, you hated Pollock. And if you loved modern art, you thought he was the greatest hero there ever was. And there was this pressure among the artists, especially in New York during the Second World War and right after the Second World War. You have to realize that New York was the city in 1950. There was nothing left anywhere in the world that was comparable to New York. And it had the most money, the most energy, the most enthusiasm, the most diversity. And the painters just were packed in New York, and they talked endlessly about art and what American art should be and what art should be. Pollock is the guy, as de Kooning said, who just went over the edge, because they were constantly coming up to that edge of just blowing it all off and going for the whole thing. And Pollock went off the edge, and de Kooning said, "I'm glad he did it. I don't have to do it." And his life is seen as tragic, and there will be a movie of Pollock. There will be a lust for life in New York, and everybody will know what it was. This painting actually was a few years after the paintings that made him infamous or famous, which were these big, loaded paintings, enormous paintings, billboard-sized paintings. And scale was one of the issues, in which Pollock used to do by laying them down on the floor, and probably everybody's seen documentaries of this, and if they haven't seen that, they've seen parodies of the painter taking the cans of paint and just sloshing them everywhere and saying this is art, and then cutting it up in pieces and all that. Well, there was an evolution to these things. There was a way in which these things came to be, and the sources are too numerous to go through. But as painters, when I talk shop, of course we're interested in the paint. What is this stuff? How come it flows like that? Well, it's Duco enamel, which violates all the rules of archival permanence and the idea that painting is forever, and that there are certain high-class stuff that you use and other low-class stuff that you don't use, and the arrival of alternative paints. Partially it was due to necessity. There was a very short supply of regular oil paints manufactured, especially in Europe during the Second World War and the period preceding it. And guys like Picasso had already themselves started using ordinary materials to make paint. Well, that had a kind of funny consequence. It put the painters back in touch with house painters, technically, where actually they should have been all along, because that's where painting got started, where people who did decorations on the palazzos and stuff like that. But painting had sort of left that. It had become a kind of philosophical domain, and people now use very elegant, Winsor Newton brushes that cost $180, and watercolors that are $26 a tube. Well, that was creamed by the Second World War, which sort of broke down the production of these things, and guys like Picasso and others just decided that they would go with this thing. Eventually in art there was a whole movement in Italy called Arte Povera, which said, let's make art with the stuff that everybody uses, And I have a friend here, John Connell, who's kind of the last living representative of that movement, who, uses household tar and chicken wire and plaster and all that, and sort of reasserts his communality with the everyday people who put up fences in this town or anywhere else. there's part of that in this, that, you know, let's take art out of that place. There's also the peculiar fluidity of the paint in comparison to art paints, which allowed a guy like him and others to get the speed up to be unconscious. And being unconscious was one of the sort of recommendations of surrealism, was to say, look, you're too tied up in the things you know, let go of that and try to operate out of something that comes more directly out of your interior life. And the speed of painting became an issue. And there were guys who were known as fast painters and guys who were known as slow painters. And speed and scale, you know, how could that, what could you have that's more American than that? Big and fast. So that represented sort of the emergence of America as a power in the world and as a power in art, and Pollock took it all the way. Now, there was a peculiar thing. This painting came after a period of depression and blockedness, and may actually be the result of blockedness, because Pollock had been doing these very large paintings that were very abstract, very gutsy. He had become celebrated as the great muscle man of American painting, this sort of athletic hero. He was like that. He punched people out at the Cedar Street bar. He was a big guy. He was, you know, he was a heavy. And people had loved it, and Peggy Guggenheim supported him. A lot of other people supported him. And then he kind of got all frozen up. And he didn't know where to go. He went to a psychiatrist, also an American experience in the arts and the culture, and he started doing totally autonomous or unconscious drawings, and there's a big bunch of those, and images started to come out, figures and bodies and all that, and he was criticized by the ideologues in the art world as abandoning the principle of abstraction, the principle of the spiritual element rather than the carnal or physical. And this whole question of an icon, you know, is painting about idol worship, or what is it about, was a big issue in one form or another. It was a religious issue, and guys like Rothko around the corner and still responded in one way, and guys like de Kooning could not let go of the reference of the tradition of the subject and the stimulus of the subject. Now, the figurative element is coded in a painting like this. It's a code that isn't too hard to decipher once you sort of know what the numbers are. And de Kooning went through periods both of painting without clear reference and periods in which there was actually a very topical subject. And actually around the time he did these, he was actually doing women standing in water at the ocean, scenes that are actually more characteristic of a kind of homey bourgeois painting about, you know, people under parasols and bathing and all that, except, you know, the twist here is a little different. But de Kooning took the notion of radicalism and gave each artist the right to be radical against the art establishment, against the prevailing ideology, and even against himself. In other words, he said, you know, painting is not a comfortable chair to sit on, was his way of saying it. You know, you're restless, you want to get up off of it, and there was a kind of nervousness. Now, as far as, for a lot of painters, including myself, de Kooning was the guy, more so than Pollock, for some of us, because there wasn't that much you could learn from Pollock. The thing about de Kooning is that de Kooning was a well-trained academic painter. He was trained in Holland. He's one of the few foreign-born guys here. I mean, I think, wasn't Guston born in Russia? Or who was born in Russia? But most of them were raised here, the guys here. Rothko was, yeah. But de Kooning actually came as a grown man, as a young grown man, to the United States, having, unlike a lot of the other guys here, really gotten a substantial academic education in painting. And he really knew painting, and he really knew Rubens. And throughout his life, his painting was characterized by a very classical palette that's called the blonde palette of Rubens and certain northern painters. And so he brought a tremendous amount of traditional loyalties, even to all his radicalism. And when he did introduce the figure earlier on in the so-called women's series, I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they were kind of very violently described, very primitive-looking frontal views of women, something like you would imagine some primitive fertility goddess that we Venus of Willendorf, he brought back the subject with a kind of vengeance, because that had none of the cool of meditation, spirituality, and sort of the loftier elements of the artist's consciousness. In other words, he brought back that particular sort of erotic grit to painting, and that friction goes on all the time in contemporary painting, and I think it's always on. I'm going to go around the corner because there's a Rothko here, which I must say I really like. For some artists, Rothko is practically a saint. With all the attendant martyrdom, he killed himself in a particularly gruesome way at a time when he seemed to be having deep personal. Speaking of which, Joan Mitchell was known for her intense and morbid depressions too. At a time when everything was expected of him, and at a time when he had sort of become the representative of a particular attitude towards painting. I guess to get the full impact of Rothko, you're close enough to Houston, all of you, that you should sometime or another go down and see the Rothko Chapel in Houston, and that'll tell you whether it does it for you or not. Because these paintings, much larger than this, but similar in mood and sense, are arranged in the Rothko Chapel as a kind of a belly button of meditation. It's a kind of octagonal building in which these enormous and uninformative paintings just sit there, and you can't do anything but get the glow and the vibration off of it. This is for me, this is probably the most radical proposition, Rothko's work. And for many years, I didn't buy it. I thought that to give up detail, to give up observation, to give up the struggle with your environment and with what you see around you, and to, in a sense, blind yourself, to give up vision, was too much of a sacrifice to make on behalf of your spirit. And I think that's different people have different senses of what their obligation in life is, and some people think they can experience Satori and want to, and other people doubt that it's possible. But the proposition is wild, and almost impossible, and yet convincing to a lot of people, including myself, ultimately. As far as whether this has a subject or not, because that was a big question that was discussed by guys like Rothko endlessly for a long time. What is the subject of the artist? Rothko was a Russian Jew who had some familiarities with with Jewish mysticism. In Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah, there is a premise that the divine, the sublime, the ultimate, is not manifest in the details. That the details are of our life. That the details are in another code. That fundamentally, the spirit comes through this thing called the Shekhinah, the divine radiance. It's just a glow that one experiences. And to try to make painting serve that is a pretty outrageous proposition, but I think that's what he was asking. This is Joan Mitchell. I don't know much about Joan Mitchell. I mean, I know, like that, as I said before, about folklore, about her chronic depressions, her escape from New York. She went to live in Paris. She didn't want to be bothered. And I think she was angry or hostile or antagonistic to the composure of traditional painting. She wanted to live off of these, what I would call kind of a zen of flashes of reactions. And even within Zen, and I have mentioned the influence of Eastern thought and Orientalism, because we don't want to be here forever. In Zen, there are two attitudes in Zen. One is the sort of mystical serenity. The other one is the sort of crazy fool Zen, where you just buck rationality. You just say to hell with it. I'm going to rely on some other impulse. And the other thing about Mitchell's work is that in spite of all that, the code here is for the landscape, just like the code there is for for the figure. And this looking for the inspiration or the libido or whatever it is, for where the source of your energy is. I mean, painters need to be energized just like anybody else. They don't operate in the kind of Apollonian environment where you sort of set yourself a task and then you do it. It just doesn't work in painting most of the time. I mean, maybe it has at some point. There's got to be an itch, a goat, a thing that makes you feel like you're getting close to primal stuff. For some painters, and especially male painters, often the female figure and all it stood as for biology, for the organism, for reproduction, for fertility, for all that stuff. On the other level, the landscape, with its fertility, its biology, its forms, also functioned for a lot of painters. And guys like Gorky, for example, who started doing Picasso-esque sort of titty, assy kind of shapes and everything, eventually went out to the country and found in the curls, the vines, the tendrils, the confusion, actually just as much formal inspiration. So there was a kind of a turning to the earth, which is also reflected in American literature and American poetry over the years. The sort of New England school of intellectual involvement with the earth was also reflected. And as soon as these guys made some money, they went out to Long Island or Connecticut. That's to say that. And New Mexico. But anyway. Painting over here is a guy called Morris Louis. I can't tell you a ton about Morris Louis because I became aware of him sort of after I had already formed opinions. And there are some paintings of his that I really like a lot. They're called Unfurled. One of the things about Louis that's interesting, throughout actually the people we're looking at here, technical changes make a big difference. The paintings of Van Gogh, which are not here, and of the Fauvists soon after, the painters who used very radically intense color, were partially made possible by the invention by German chemists of synthetic pigments that were able to be opaque and brilliant. There were no cadmium yellows in the 17th and 18th century, no azo reds, no phthalo. So even if those painters had wanted to bring the pitch of painting up that high, they couldn't have done it. There wasn't any technical material. So the invention in the 1850s of synthetic dyes made an enormous difference. Then I talked about Duco enamels, and these paintings are these stained paintings, of which there are a whole generation of painters subsequent to this. Sam Francis and Helen Frankenthaler, who may be contemporary, were based on the availability of acrylic paints that are as tough as oils but run like water. Something that wasn't available to oil painters in the past. So it allowed painters to sort of experiment in a totally different way with liquid. And at that moment, the question of Oriental painting, which is often done with very runny mediums and everything, comes up. The sort of fluid thing where gravity is played with backwards and forwards, and a whole other sensation. I'm not going to go on a long run to try to justify this painting. There is a justification, and maybe Sam will justify it. There is something about letting go that is a fact in all the paintings we see, that is played out in a kind of large and open and decorative and handsome way in some of these paintings. And also the whole issue of color theory, which I haven't talked about, which was a big issue starting from 1850 when scientists were instructing the artists on the color wheel, and that it was possible maybe to have a painting that was abstract the way music is abstract, based on fundamental harmonies and nothing else. The problem for a lot of painters and for the viewers is that vision doesn't seem to work like hearing. That hearing, you can hear things and not necessarily be reminded of anything, but somehow it seems like the function of vision is recognition. And that as soon as you see something primeval in you says, what is it? And the effort to sort of create a field of visual world where you don't ask what is it is very difficult. Although in Islam, the image has been banned for 500 years, and in traditional Jewish orthodoxy, there's a fear of the recognizable. So I think that there is a place where where people try to organize what you see without getting you to venerate what's underlying it, because that's idolatry. And Islam has been a great force in that over the centuries, and I think a lot of the painting of the 60s especially, the early paintings of Stella, at that time we used to call it the Islamization of art, which was at the same time that PLO was becoming popular and stuff like that. I just thought that maybe the Middle East was beginning to play a role. If you can have a whole culture that doesn't need to be shown the world, that are satisfied to see an endless mosaic of beauty, maybe it's possible. It's hard for Western artists to do. Shall I proceed? Did I miss anything?
Klein.
Oh, and the Franz Klein. Well, there's a little quote about jazz down below Franz Klein, and there was a big interplay between the abstract expressionists, and I'm not saying that defines Franz Klein's work, but there is a play between the kind of intuitiveness that surrealists talked about and the improvisational nature of jazz. And I happened to live in New York just at the time that painting was done, and Thelonious Monk was playing up the street, and you know, Central Supply was delivering endless hundreds of tubes of Winsor Newton Ivory Black to Franz Klein, and there was this kind of hipster time. I mean, it demeans Klein's work to put it in that perspective, but I think it's part of what happened in the 50s and the 60s was sheer raw energy. And Klein was one of the guys who had the drafting skills, the kind of, he actually, if you look in a certain way, you can see Rubens in de Kooning, and you can see Rembrandt in Klein. I know it's hard, but Klein was a very feverish and energetic and facile and smooth draftsman. And at one point, the legend goes, in the Kooning studio, they got an overhead projector, which was a big deal in those days, and they projected some of Klein's little drawings of chairs and stuff on de Kooning's wall, and somehow taking that brushstroke and blowing it up like that just had a kind of tremendous impact on a lot of the people who were there, and on Klein himself, and the idea that the pure motion of pulling a line through from one place to the other, redirecting it, focusing it, and everything could have all the passion of a crucifixion, which is basically two lines crossing one another. Was one of the, I mean, in order to believe that, you had to believe a lot of things before that, which had to do with the whole existentialist temper of the times, the readings of Sartre and Kierkegaard and Camus and all that, to prepare oneself for that possibility. But it was laying there. Louis, how are you? Series of spontaneous ink drawings that he did, that he called Elegy of the Spanish Republic, and they vary. There are a long set of paintings there. I don't know, 50 or more paintings, maybe 200 of paintings, in which these sort of blobs are contained by these vertical bars. In some ways, it's actually a very intellectual proposition. I don't know if you can express the pathos of these kind of sentiments that way. I have seen other paintings. I have an odd feeling about this painting, that the peculiar flatness of this painting, whether Motherwell painted it or his assistants painted it, I don't know, somehow or other is a denial of the force of the thing. So this painting is compromised to me. I've seen other paintings of Motherwell's in which these forms are generated with a lot more heat in some way, and I find it more convincing. This painting just seems like, you know, in their own lifetime, Pollock's most outrageous and radical impulses were turned into linoleum for kitchens. And, you know, and we started stepping on all these drip kitchens. So where sincerity and the capacity to feel things sincerely, as you might the first time, is a very difficult thing, I think, for people. And here, I think I'm looking at some reproduction of Motherwell. I don't see it. I mean, not that Motherwell has ever been a complete I mean, like the guy who taught me the most, or hardly at all. But he was an ideologue about painting and about the possibilities of painting. He studied French literature and French philosophy. He was a specialist. He knew Mallarmé, Apollinaire, Baudelaire, the so-called romantic sources. That's the problem with all these sort of theories about art, is you can talk about Baudelaire being the first romanticist, and you can talk about Motherwell being in the crowd, but when you look at this painting, you know, where's Baudelaire? And this guy, Augustine, has a tremendous personal history and regained his respect among artists of my generation after a period of sort of being dismissed or disregarded. When he actually returned from a decade of painting without a subject, or apparently without a subject, to a kind of cartoony painting that was ridiculed when he started doing it again. When, in the 60s? Early 70s. Yeah, early 70s. Sam's going to give a lecture at 3. You should go and listen to him.
No, but it's great.
Because Sam studied with Guston and knew Guston, and is very familiar with the ins and outs of Guston's life, both personally and his position in art. When I first saw Guston's paintings in the 50s and 60s, he was, as I say, a subjectless painter, except that there was a lot of atmosphere in his painting. And I thought he was one of the lesser of the abstract expressionists. I thought that he was kind of cool, and he was a little bit too fluffy, too candy-like, the colors are sweet, and of course the colors are quite sweet here too, and they're more well managed than most of the abstract expressionists in the sense that he really knows all about these little gray tonalities and the color contrast and everything like that. And so I dismissed Motherwell as a kind of academic guy who had sort of made a home for himself in abstraction. Later I found out more about him. I realized that he was kind of a social radical and a tortured guy. And sometime in the late 60s, early 70s, he started going back to early subjects of his, doing very kind of ugly paintings of boots, hobnail boots, Ku Klux Klan hats, and tweaking again, although in the beginning it looked like an awfully desperate move on his part, just at the time when everybody said abstraction is dead. Suddenly he recovers from being an abstractionist. I really suspect it. But but I've become more convinced over the years, and there's a kind of peculiar myth-making capacity in these paintings, that goes back to poetic possibility, that simple objects, maybe like Morandi painted, which look at first to be random and not necessarily informative, take on a sudden presence, and you feel something, autobiographical dimension behind there that's troubling. And then if you know more about him, you know what these bottles are, and then you know that that's his wife's head sort of emerging like a rising sun, or sinking like a setting sun, depending. He did a whole series of these very mysterious and really novel imagery that I think set up like a new page in the poetry of painting. Okay, now to the young guys. Rosenquist and Stella have been associated, although I'll talk about Rosenquist first. And I tell you, this is an interesting painting for me, to just look at it. Because, Rosenquist is considered like one of the pop painters. And they drew into sort of the commonplace imagery of everyday American life, especially the life of advertising and of the sort of popular customer-oriented images, the bacon and potentially, I don't know, we tried to figure out who this fragment of the face was, and we came up with Twiggy, the model who was so popular in the 60s. But Rosenquist is a peculiar guy because the collage-like way in which he constructs these things links him back to what we're called the anti-artists or something. The Dadaists who assembled their manifestos out of popular brochures and stuff like that. But one of the things, the pop artists constitute a rebellion against the patriarchal domination of the abstract expressionists in New York. I happen to be living in New York around that time, and I saw that play out. One of the things about the pop artists was that they rejected this heavy reliance on the painterly hand of the abstract expressionists, and they kind of neutralized the surface again, either like Warhol by painting very flat and very, or just reproducing things, lifting things. There was a kind of disgust with the arrogance and the vanity that had developed around the theories of abstract expressionism, that just because some guy happens to jerk his hand in a particular way, and there is Basil 20 years later doing it, but that because some guy, twists his hand in a particular way and has a particular signature, that somehow was deeply informative about the soul, the psyche, the eros, and all that. I'm not siding with that rejection. I'm just saying that there was a passionate sensation, like we're sick and tired of these guys laying all their personal vibrations on us. But the interesting, and so the pop artists kind of adopted a kind of neutrality, like Lichtenstein using commercial Band-Aid dot screens in order to paint things and just say, we don't need that. There is other artists about other things too. Although in Lichtenstein's work, you have constant reference to the gestures of the Expressionists. Well, this is an interesting painting because actually there is more painting in this than there is in the mother book of that sort. And I was kind of looking at it. And you're not supposed to get too close here, folks. And you look at the painting of this guy's actually a painter. I mean, he's actually painting these things. This is not some mechanical reproduction. And then the tangle of references throws this straight back into surrealism. It's all very, very so classy and so clever that sometimes I think people don't want to deal with it. And I can understand it. I mean, to take a bunch of candles and then think fire, passion, and Twiggy's eyeless gaze of a classical mass. I mean, to put this whole symbolism together is a bit of a task. But I think it tries to sort of go back to functions of art that are like that, that are about sort of taking themes of sentiment and history and passion and reality and finding a way to express it. And he's most famous for an enormous painting called F-111 that he did. He was also very famous as a protester in the Vietnam War. And I think, was he jailed? I think he was. And he did this painting which was kind of this enormous, almost full-scale painting of a jet with all the images of the American garbled psyche, spaghetti and Marilyn Monroe and the whole thing into one big package. So, you know what I'm like. You know him.
I know him, yes.
Sure. What's your time?
This is your show. I thought you were going to talk more about the squiggles over there.
Well, no, the squiggles are almost like Lichtenstein's mockery of expressiveness. But I was just thinking, if you look at the painting around the canvas, it's really painted. I mean, he goes around those things, and there's no effort to make it look like an illustration without any surface. Yeah. He actually accepts the paint. Although, before he became famous, this guy was a billboard painter. I mean, actually painted billboards. And so he really knows something that is part of the traditional craft of painters, which is he knows how close you're going to get, how far you're going to be away from it, what reads, what doesn't read, what needs to be smoothed out and what doesn't. And so. Oh yeah, he's a young guy. Our age. Oh yeah, he's had, like all the big painters, or most of them, in the last 10 or 15 years, these guys have had a hard time. These guys were very successful and, bought into a pretty, comfortable lifestyle. And I think some of these guys are having their problems, like all of us.
The smart ones put a little bit away.
When I first saw Stella's paintings in California, Stella was doing very geometrically measured paintings that were in 3 or 4 very simple formats. They were bands, monochrome bands that were either organized in a cruciform shape or a zigzag or straight across. They looked like they were, well, they were exemplars of what was at that time called minimalism. And what I call that Islamic thing. It just looked like tile work except done in paint. The distinction, but right away I liked them. And partially was that they were incredible. Stella was in his early 30s. He got a one-man show. He was the first guy ever to have a one-man show, a retrospective at such an early age. He was thought at that time to be sort of the guy in America. And I always wondered why the hell he got that show. I mean, he was 31. He had accomplished a lot. And I realized, thinking about Stella in those days, that Stella's work at that time answered almost every academic question about what painting was supposed to be in the future. It answered the whole question about, you know, the painting as an object and yet at the same time being something else. It was colorist without being colorful. It just answered a ton of questions. It was 2.5 dimensions, you know, it stood out of the wall while still being a flat painting. I mean, it just answered everything. He was the darling, I think, of the intellectual world that had taken a hold of painting. It was poppy, and it wasn't poppy. Anyhow, he turned everything around on himself. He got involved with, and he's written about it, and he's a very smart guy, and he teaches Yale or gives seminars. He himself got involved with asking the question about what was the power of the painters of the Renaissance, and was that power in the painting of today? I don't know that he asked it that way, but that was the idea. He studied a lot, or concentrated a lot on the work of Caravaggio, the most theatrical of the Renaissance painters, I mean, by far. And in some ways, very peculiar painter, but a very powerful, dramatic painter. And out of his interest in that, I'm not saying directly out of it, Stella got involved with some kind of spatial dynamism that he sensed in Caravaggio, a kind of emotional charge to color and space, and changed the work. His work changed in accordance with that. And these works of his now have more of that sort of movement from classicism, which he was associated with originally, towards a more baroque, more theatrical, more expressive, more gestural thing. I happen to like the earlier, but you know, it's just me. And this painting is by a German artist called Baselitz. I can't say I know a ton about Baselitz, except that I've looked at reproductions of his work and seen a couple of his work in the museums. There was a crew of European artists, or a bunch of European artists, that kind of became of dramatic interest in New York sometime in the 70s especially. They were roughhouse in a way that New York artists had stopped being roughhouse. There had been a tremendous cooling of the work in New York. There was a big era of the dominance of minimalist impulses, Ellsworth Kelly, Kenneth Nolan, and a whole bunch of other people I'm sure I'm not mentioning. And even the artists who weren't like that were being cooled out. Meanwhile, somewhere in Italy and somewhere in Germany, apparently, a lot of guys were working in garrets, just like the New York artists had, relatively unknown and everything, and rededicating themselves to loyalties that they had at their youth that were no longer in fashion in New York. And out of that came a bunch of guys like Kiefer and this guy who kind of brought back a kind of big physical and emotional energy into painting. And there must have been a kind of appetite left over in the big cities for that painting. And this work is actually much more lyrical and delicate than a lot, if you can believe it, than a lot of Basilitz's work. And a lot of Basilitz's work is just outright hostile. He does heads that he carves out of wood with an axe that look like the worst thing you ever saw in Kon-Tiki. And for a long time he exhibited all his paintings upside down only. This one happens to be kind of on its side and and in two directions. This is like a playing card. There's a kind of a figure going this way with a head here, and there's a figure going this way with a head here. So it's upside down and sideways all at once. And the draftsmanship in this tube squeezing thing is actually very reminiscent of some of the more intense drawing of de Kooning's in the 50s and 60s, when he was de-analyzing or breaking down the female icon in some way. I think this is a beautiful painting, by the way. And the surface is as rich and luminous as the most dedicated field paintings. So I think this is a great thing. And then Susan Rothenberg, who sometime or another lives here, who I don't know personally, who kind of came into my awareness with a series of paintings she did 10 years ago, I guess, in which she analyzed or used repeatedly the subject of a running horse. And again, it was one of those gestures that challenges the question of whether painting should be about something or shouldn't be about something, whether it's all about its own rhythms, its own sort of almost physical energy, or do we have to deal with an icon that in itself has its own meaning? Well, she played with that or made variations. And this whole thing of variations, where you take one subject and do it over, just to loop around, since we started with Monet, and since this painting in some ways is oddly reminiscent in some of its passages of Monet. It was Monet who started this thing of taking the same subject and treating it over and over and over again. The justification, the intellectual justification, was that nothing was the same at any different time of day, so that you could never make the definitive painting of the haystacks. There are haystacks at 6 in the morning, haystacks at 8 in the morning, and then there are haystacks when you have a headache, and so like the old Heraclitus, you're never in the same, you can't stand in the same river ever more than once. The river's not the same, you're not the same. Well, this Rothenberg's sort of recasting of the whole question of the horse, in which eventually became very abstracted and just long lines of force throughout it. And here we have another example, and I don't know what she's up to because I don't know her and everything, but here you have an image that's repeated within the painting, which is, if you want to think about Duchamp's nude descending the staircase or whatever, this sense that the painting somehow get a hold of the transience of things, that nothing is fixed in a place given at a time, and that the painting simply, in some ways, is a pretext for anything the artist wants to do. Any energy, anything that takes over, any horizontality, anything, as long as it gets fully lived out in the painting, that's what the painting becomes. That's it. Okay. I will respond to questions. All right? Good. I'll see you.
Well, let me ask you, before you leave, like with the Stella, and you summed up how he had sort of managed to make these very, what you call successful paintings, very early on in his career. And he was playing with that dimension. And then now in these later paints where he's actually making these very physical things, they're still hanging on the wall. Where is he going from here?
Well, what I read this in Caravaggio, and I think that you can't steal the power without the subject. That in Caravaggio the necessity comes, whether it's spurious or not, from the artist's feeling like there's some sensation that he actually has to get a hold of, that it isn't pure dynamism in some way. And these look to me a little bit like the Italian dynamist stuff, in which you're in love with drama and power, but you have no subject. That's my experience.
You see, I can't. That's
why. You gotta admire the experimentalism.
That's what in my head.
I'm a painter. Yes.
Very good painter. He shows the Linda Durham.
Where did you live?
I'm sorry?
In South America. Where did you live?
In Colombia.
In Colombia.
Where did you live?
No, I'm not Venezuela.
Venezuela?